Thank you, Joachim. To the eminent Cardinal Turkson, thank you for showing that gripping video. The real sadness about that video is that we could have avoided all of the disasters you show had we acted about 20 years ago. But fortunately, it's still not too late. And I'm truly honored to give the opening talk at this event. I'll try to set the stage. And I want to thank all the speakers who have assembled there. And my apologies for not being able to join you in person. During the mid to late last week, 4 of my family members whom I interact on a daily basis, including my wife, all came down with COVID. So I got my first exposure to the importance of resilience when I joined His Eminence Cardinal Turkson as part of his Holy See delegation to the Paris Summit. He held series of meetings with small island nations and many African nations. And I had, as a science advisor, had the front row seat and learned intimate details of human suffering. The idea for this meeting became concrete during a Zoom call with our President Joachim when he called me last year to invite me to join the council for a second term. But our conversation quickly got into climate change. And the two of us felt, well, it's about time we held a meeting on the resilience. And Joachim has been a hands-on planning committee member involved in all aspects of it. I honestly consider him as a co-chair of this meeting. Of course, we'll not be here without the leadership and championship of our former chancellor, Bishop Sanchez Serrando. I have worked with and collaborated with Marcello in 4 such meetings, which have been the most fruitful of my endeavors in climate change. Thank you, Marcello. So let me start with the first slide. I'm going to address 3 questions about resilience: why, when, and how. So this is sort of a lovelier journey. And it started with a meeting with Paul Crutzen I had organized on the mountain glaciers in 2011. We then followed this with this meeting jointly between the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences and Pontifical Academy of Sciences. Pratha Das Gupta, member of PASS, and I, along with Marcello, co-organized this. And at the end of it, we came with a declaration. And let me read the declaration. We published it in Science magazine, Das Gupta and myself. Sustainable relationship with nature requires change in attitude towards nature and towards each other, and therefore requires moral leadership. So it's an amazing conclusion for a group of scientists to come with, but moral leadership. And we were fortunate at the end of the meeting to brief the Holy Father, Pope Francis, whom I think of this as a moral leader for the world. A year later, he of course published his famous climate document, Laudato Si, in which he summarized everything we told him into one sentence: cry of the earth should be heard with the cry of the poor. Then 3 years later, we realized health has to be brought to the front stage. So we held a meeting on health of people and health of planet. This was a collaboration between the Pontifical Academy and WHO. And we concluded climate effects on human health, poses one of the gravest dangers about climate change. So first, let me ask the question, why resilience? And it was summarized beautifully by the Working Group 2 report of IPCC, in which it says, climate change is a threat to human well-being and planetary health any further delay in concerted global action on adaptation and mitigation. I don't know if it's significant they mentioned adaptation first. We will miss a brief and rapidly closing window of opportunity. So that's the why. And it really conveys the urgency of the issue we are dealing with today. Now let me address the question of when. This is a study we published in 2018, about 4 years ago, where we concluded that global warming would go past the so-called dangerous threshold of 1.5 degree warming. As of today, the planet is already warmed by about 1 to 1.2 degrees. So it's my personal feeling that climate change will transition to the climate disruption when we pass the 1.5 degree warming worldwide in about 10 years or less. So that's the time scale we are talking about. So we have to start building the resilience now. And what does IPCC say? At the time we published, IPCC said we will cross the 1.5 degree warming only in mid-2040s. This report has changed that, advanced it by 10 years. I don't know how much it was motivated by our study, but they conclude that the central estimate of crossing 1.5 degrees of global warming occurs in the early 2030. 10 years earlier than what they had forecast. So there's no big disagreement here. So we are facing what I think of a major climate crises, much worse than what we have experienced now in about 8 to 10 years. So now from there, I go on to the issue of how. The rest of my talk is basically, I put together from available reports and numerous other publications. Okay? So we are obviously dealing with three major crises: inequality, climate change, and biodiversity. Professor Jane Lubchenco would talk about the biodiversity issue and why it's as much of a crisis as climate change. That will be the last talk on day 2. You will hear about the science of climate change from the next 2 speakers, Professor John Schellenhuber and Susan Solomon. There are many speakers today who are going to talk about the inequality issue. It's just in every topic. So I think of resilience. First, various definitions are there. This is the one I like the best. Capacity to prepare and plan for, absorb, recover from, and adapt to climate risks. Remember, the adaptation part has to be done all the way from an individual, bottom up, a community to a city, state, nation, and worldwide. The 3 pillars are mitigation. Basically, why do we mitigate? We want to reduce the climate risks. The second pillar is adaptation. Hopefully, we would have reduced the risk to manageable levels, and we need to prepare society for adaptation. We know neither of it, mitigation or adaptation, is going to happen at the scale, at the speed is required, without some fundamental transformation of the socio-ecological system. This has been mentioned repeatedly by many experts. So the transformation is part of the mitigation and adaptation. Just to give you one example. For 30 years, UNFCCC has negotiated climate agreements. And our emissions peaked last year, carbon emissions. So the curve is not bending, it's still rising. So we need some transformation approach. So let me just define risks. So risk is thought of as a product of vulnerability and threat. The threat is here we're dealing with climate change, also biodiversity and other the problems that contribute to the threat. The vulnerability of the population is depends on 3 things: sensitivity. How sensitive are you to a particular event? For example, I have asthma. I'm extremely sensitive to fire, smoke, exposure. There could be disasters outside. How much are you exposed? Okay. And then the third is adaptive capacity. That's what we need to build. The issue with the adaptive capacity is, what do we adapt to? How much warming should we expect? So those are some scientific questions have to be asked. So going back again, the threat you decrease by mitigation, you reduce the sensitivity to the threats, you reduce the exposure to the threats, and build adaptive capacity. All right. So these three, reducing the sensitivity, reducing the exposure, and building adaptive capacity, has to be part of the resilience topic. So there are three separate issues here we have to deal with. So this is just a summary of what are the threats. We are seeing extreme heat. They become more frequent, more intense, more heavy. When it rains, it pours. More frequent and more intense. Droughts, I'll show you some example of the droughts. Fire weather, and the whole series of issues involved in the ocean ecosystem. Warming of the ocean, acidifying it, coral reefs are bleaching. Some of the ocean regions become anoxic, losing oxygen, and the sea level. So let me just talk about the pillar one, mitigation. How much of this warming curve can be bent by 2050? The warming is about 1.2 degrees now. It will hit about 1.5 by 2030. Based on my own work with my colleagues, I think that's at least a 60% probability that we will hit that. And IPCC says early 2030, so instead of 2030, it could be 2031, 32, etc. What I have inferred from IPCC and numerous other publications, I think Dr. Susan Solomon would elaborate on this, even with maximum possible bending of the emissions curve. I'm not talking about reducing it to zero tomorrow. That's why it's a possible bending. There's so much inertia in the system. Warming by 2050, the 30 years from now, can only be reduced to slightly less than 2 degrees, but it's still going to be above 1.5. That is assuming we are only talking about mitigation actions, not stuff like geoengineering. So my own recommendation is that we have to prepare a resilience planning for a 2-degree warming, at least for the next 30 years. Well, it's going back. Sorry. So let's talk about, again, the issue of resilience. How? First, who needs to mitigate? All of us. But some are more responsible than others and need to lead the climate actions. I'll talk about that soon. And who needs to adapt? Again, all of us, but some are more vulnerable than others and need immediate attention. So I'm just showing you the fundamental source of the moral ethical issue of this whole climate change problem, and also who needs to mitigate and who needs to adapt. This curve shows on the x-axis, horizontal in terms of billions of population, going from 1 billion to 7 billion. On the vertical, it shows the carbon emissions. If you focus on the left-hand side, 16% of the populations, 1.2 billion, contribute 38% to the emissions. This is just data for 2016. If you look at accumulated, then this 1 billion population contribution is even closer to 50%. That's the high income group. Then comes the upper middle income. And together with the high income, it's about 51% of the global population, emitting 86% of the global CO2. So this half the population is responsible for most of these emissions, while the other half lower middle income, and low income, they suffer the consequences. Why? Because they are vulnerable and they are exposed more and they have the least adaptive capacity. So this is not an issue in my mind saying help out the poor. It's an issue of where we have inflicted huge pain on half the population who unfortunately don't have a high enough income. So let me just, sorry. Yeah. So let's focus on this lower middle income and extremely, poverty. There are about 3 billion people on the planet. They're forced by poverty to rely on 18th century technologies. This is a woman and her husband and 2 children living in the Himalayas. I was their house guest. And their contribution to CO2, the climate change, etc., is just close to 5%, this 3 billion. And they're mainly living in rural areas. And let me give you an example of why they're going to be the worst hit. And I think the 1.5 degree warming, in my personal view, not scientific view, is like a cliff for them. This is one of our results where we looked at which regions are drying. We just plotted the change in the precipitation minus the change in what we call vapor pressure deficit. That's the potential for evaporation. Of course, you see the American Southwest and the entire Mediterranean, China, Australia, South Africa, and Amazon. They're already drying. This is actual, from data. It's not a model simulation. There was a study published, 3 of them. They already said on the Amazon, Amazon is losing its resilience since the early 2000s. Okay? So disasters are happening on local to larger scale. Now we can ask, can it get any worse? Very few talk about this issue. This is what's called fat tails in the probability distribution. Low probability, high impact event, but 5 to 10% probability. Most of our focus is on the central value, 50% probability. But these things can happen. Just to give you an example, this is a simulation by a Princeton University NOAA joint study. They talk about with unchecked emissions, what will happen by 2100. You can just see the whole Amazon, the entire Southwest. I'm living in this one of these potentially extreme droughts. And look at the Mediterranean, Southern Africa. But because of the fat tails, they could make it happen much earlier, 25, 30 years from now. Okay? This fat tail, in my mind, poses one of the fundamental challenges in designing resilience and designing adaptation capabilities. But we just have to live with this. So now let me go to the pillar 3, transformation. That transformation is required on the societal side, socio-ecological economics. There are many speakers going to talk about this. Behavioral changes is essential, trust in science, mass education of the public. I want to conclude with the topic, and interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary climate science. See, I'm just showing 2 ellipses. On the right side is the climate model. Our climate models don't even know that human beings exist. So they just are a geophysical, chemical, physical models. So what we scientists do is to say, what should we do with the carbon cycle? What should we do with this to bring the warming down? So it's more prescriptive what society should do. They don't factor in what is the society capable of doing. But just look at America. We have not passed a single climate bill of substance. So now there is a new generation of this natural system, social system models interacting, starting. Just in the last 5 years, I would say Professor Schellenhuber's Institute has made some pioneering steps in this. So this is a major thing we need to see happen, bring in societal behavior into our models so that we can address what society can do as opposed to what society should do. On the education side, we just have to simply educate everyone all the way from kindergarten to the grave. So we started such a program, Bending the Curve, University of California, and we have just finished developing this for undergraduates of all expertise, humanities, social science, natural science. It's being taught in many campuses. It's also taught at Stockholm University with quite a bit of success. And the state is now extending it to K-12 program. What I think we need is mass education of the public. I'm not talking about giving them courses, etc., but just to educate them so that we can unpack climate change from all the other issues that divides us. At least in America, climate change has got mixed up with everything else. So we need to unpack it, and I think this is something we have been pushing. This is a statement by Partha Dasgupta and myself. We need to form an alliance between science, policy, and faith. The transformational step may well be a massive mobilization of public opinion by the Vatican and other faith-based institutions. As we all know, Catholic schools are worldwide. In India, I was in a very small town, got educated in a Catholic school. I think there's a huge potential here. And for collective action to safeguard the well-being of both humanity and the environment. So let me conclude with this. This is my personal view. I'm not reflecting any view of the Pontifical Academy or as a chair of the meeting. It's just based on my science. If we begin in earnest now, we have until 2040 to bend and flatten the warming curve, build adaptive capacity, we have about 25 years to do that, and achieve a safe transition. Thank you.